Welcome, everyone. We'll be getting started in just 1 minute as folks join the room. Okay, good afternoon, everyone. I think we will go ahead and get started since we have a lot to cover in today's timely discussion. Welcome, we're so happy to have everyone here. My name is Neda Zuhdi, and I'm the director of the Opengov Hub, which is putting on today's event. For anyone who doesn't already know us, the Opengov Hub started in 2012, and we are a meeting place that brings together a community of many different organizations who are promoting open governments and empowered citizens around the world in many different ways. We support our network through shared resources and constant opportunities to learn and collaborate with each other, including through events and programs like this one today. And we have a network of 50 organizations and over 300 people who are part of this community. So we're very happy to welcome the members in the room and friends and partners of the Opengov Hub today as well. And today's event on election crises in polarized democracies very much builds on an existing body of work that we started in 2017 called Defending Democracy: Lessons from Around the World. This program is designed to really help us face new and unprecedented challenges to American democracy by learning from international examples that are relevant to our current times. And today's event also builds on a more recent blog series called Outside In from Global Integrity, which features a number of different international perspectives on domestic challenges here in the United States. So it's very much in that spirit today that we continue the conversation to do this comparative learning to face current challenges. You'll see an intro poll coming up. Please feel free to chime in about where you're calling in from. But today's event is the second in a 3-part series this October, focused on the election season that we're facing here in the US. The goal of today is really to learn from other electoral crises that have happened recently in 3 particular countries that share characteristics with the United States, especially a state of high political polarization and similar risks around contested results, risks of outbreaks of violence around the elections, and more. So the stakes are clearly very high as we're less than 2 weeks from the US presidential election. But the good news is that we don't have to tackle these challenges alone. We know that democracies always need defending, and we can really help better prepare ourselves for whatever scenario happens by learning from these other examples. So with that, I will be introducing our speakers in just 1 minute, but I'll ask Isabella as our host for today to just briefly share how you in the audience can engage in today's conversation.
Hi, I'm Isabel. I'm the program manager at Opengov Hub, and I will quickly tell you how to engage. So right now you have the intro poll. It will be open for maybe another minute or so, and you can see 2 boxes, the chat box and the Q&A box. The chat box is just for regular conversation and any comments, but please do use the Q&A box to ask any questions. You can also upvote them. You can do this throughout the session, but generally we will get to them at the very end after the discussion. And please watch out for another poll, which I will launch in a minute. That will basically capture how we're feeling about this election and what are the biggest concerns. Thanks.
Perfect. Yeah, thank you so much, Isabella. So with that, I'm so delighted to introduce our 4 incredible speakers today, 3 international panelists giving us international perspectives, and our moderator. So the 3 panelists that we'll be hearing from in order. First of all, we have Krzysztof Idebeski. I'm still working on the pronunciation, but Krzysztof is a board member and policy director of I Państwo Foundation, which is based in Warsaw, Poland. He's a lawyer specialized in freedom of information and public participation and the relation between technology and democracy. So again, his organization is based in Poland, but is operating throughout the Central Eastern European region and the EU. And he's a Marshall Memorial Fellow. So again, Krzysztof will give us a perspective from Poland. Next, we will move to Rodrigo Diamanti. Rodrigo is the founder of an organization called Un Mundo Sin Mordaza. Sorry again for pronunciations. But this is an organization in Venezuela that is working to address polarization in that country. He's been living in exile out of Venezuela since 2015, after he was arbitrarily detained in 2014 by the Maduro's regime. He's a graduate of the Harvard Kennedy School and has 15 years experience defending human rights in Venezuela and Latin America. And our third speaker is Manu Bhagavan. Manu is a professor of history, human rights, and public policy at Hunter College. And he'll be sharing some perspectives on challenges to democracy faced in India. And finally, I'm really delighted to introduce and hand it over to Dr. Rachel Kleinfeld to be our moderator today. She's a senior fellow in democracy, conflict, and governance at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. And she's a leading expert on how democracies, including in the United States, can improve with a particular focus on addressing challenges of poor leadership, polarization, violence, and corruption. Thank you everyone so much for being here. And Rachel, please take it away.
Thank you so much, Nada. Thank you for the opportunity. Opengov Hub is just a treasure and a resource for all of us. And it's an honor to be with you. It's an honor to be with this fabulous panel of people who have been fighting the good fight within their own countries. And I'm going to try to keep my moderation tight and short so that we can really focus on them. I think many Americans have been very slow to recognize how much we have to learn from countries facing these problems. Venezuela looks very far away. Its problems seem much more dire, but the speed and rapidity at which democracies can decline, as shown in Poland and Hungary, is shocking and is important for us to recognize. It's also important for us to recognize that polarization in America is almost worse than any other country on earth, according to Thomas Carruthers. You probably saw me reaching into my bookshelf to grab my colleague's book here, Democracies Divided. Tom Carruthers at Carnegie has just written it about polarization globally. And what he found was that in the United States, unlike many places, all of our identities are lining up. It's not just that you're polarized along class lines or racial lines or religious lines or geographic lines. All of these things put you on the same side of one equation or the other, so that I can tell you what alcoholic beverage of choice I tend to drink, and what TV show I watch, and you can tell me my political affiliation and what part of the country I live in. That is problematic. And what it means is that it's far more difficult to solve our problems. And it's very easy to pigeonhole an issue as belonging to one partisan side or the other. And once that issue gets pigeonholed that way, it is unsolvable because of the level of polarization. That's bad enough when it's an issue of something like infrastructure or abortion or how to give welfare to important parts of your population. But it's deadly when democracy itself gets pigeonholed, and when the very rules of the game become seen as a way that one side is trying to manipulate the other, so that there's no way to come to a common consensus on how to have free and fair elections or how to have a nonviolent polity. And that's where we are in some of these countries, and it's where we might be in America. And that's why it's so important to learn these lessons now. So what we're going to do is start with 5 minutes each on where these countries are, what has happened in these countries over the last few years. It's just going to be 5 minutes. Then we're going to go into moderated discussion. And then please, I deeply encourage you, as questions come up, write them in the Q&A, upvote the ones that you think are really good, and we'll try to take as many as we can. So Krzysztof, I'm going to turn to you first to give us a quick overview. What's happened to Poland? Why are you here?
Thank you so much, Rachel. Thank you, Nada and Opengov Hub for having me here. Unfortunately, not in person, but still there's a good chance to talk about the issues that are more and more global. And I think this is one of the problems that we're facing. Is not the problem in one country, in one region. What we are having here is a global tendency, democratic tendency, which is visible globally. I would just, because I have just 5 minutes, I would just make few points on the experiences from Poland and how it is also, it may be seen from the global perspective. So first of all, the polarization in Poland hadn't started in 2015 when the Law and Justice Party, the ruling party, went into power. This is, and it was a tactic of the populist movement, to polarize people, to mobilize the electorates. But other thing is, I don't believe we have electorates anymore. We have believers, and that's one of the consequences of the polarization. And it's a very conscious tactic, political tactics, because it helps to win political battles, not only elections. The other point is not a revolution. It is step by step, starting from dismantling the Constitutional Tribunal. This was like a very first week when they came into power in 2015. They completely fought with the independence of Constitutional Tribunal and the judiciary a bit later, which is of course a bit easy because they were using the fact that a lot of people were unsatisfied with some rulings, which is obvious because you have both sides. What someone is winning, someone is losing, but it's really a really good example of how you can polarize the people around judiciary. For example, today it's worth to mention that this Constitutional Tribunal and actually the government through the lips of Constitutional Tribunal actually banned abortion in Poland. 21st century. This was just happened today, a few hours ago. It is naive to say that the strong institutions would protect us because they're living human beings who form these institutions. So they are putting their political agenda. The institution, the walls of the institution can't protect the democracy if the people are not willing to do so. The thing that I already shared, but I think it's really crucial, especially when we're talking, and I'm representing like open data community here, that we think that, you know, data, evidence, rationalism is an argument. It's not, because what the polarization is about is to construct a believer, not a member of the public. And you can't use the rational arguments with believers. That's the problem. So it is in the consequence, the understanding of democracy is like, we have majority, we won the elections, we can do whatever we want because we have a mandate from people. And it doesn't matter the rule of law, the protecting minority, no, majority just elected us, we can do whatever we want. The other problem is Poland is not alone. I mean, you mentioned Hungary, there's also Bulgaria, there's Venezuela, there's UK, United Kingdom, and United States. The problem from human rights defenders is like, we don't have a good country now to refer to. Like showing, hey, look, I mean, these are the democratic standards. It's not working anymore. We could talk about it like 15, 20 years ago, maybe, or during the communist times, of course, saying this is the Western world principles or fundamentals. The problem with being also a member of European Union, I think, and this is what was proved by the European Union in the last couple of years, it's too weak to protect the rule of law. Because it's external. We can go back to this context later, but we do feel that we are not fully protected by the membership, but being a members of European Union. And that's it, I think, for this. We're not very much surprised of the developments of things, and we actually feel a bit helpless, and that's quite frustrating. Maybe I will be more optimistic when it comes to the questions and answer later. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Christoph, both for the sobering beginning and for modeling 5 minutes. Rodrigo, the problems in Venezuela started before, so you have a longer time horizon to cover, but perhaps you can also try for the 5-minute rule. Thank you.
Thank you, Rachel, and thank you, Opengov Hub. I really relate also with Christopher's story. And it is true, everything started in 1999 in Venezuela, when the society was angry because no one was getting any benefits from the growth, economical growth, revenue that came from the oil industry. And what happened after that is Chavez, President Chavez at that time, he passed away some years ago, but when he arrived to the political arena, he didn't arrive with a normal plan. He had a plan to transform the political system, but he knew that in order to do that, he needed to polarize society, just the same way Christoph explained, to have believers, to have people that will support him because he was taking care of the enemy. And in Venezuela, the enemy that was inside was the opposition, and outside Venezuela was the US. Even I remember people outside of Venezuela were supporters of Chavez just because he was representing the anti-American sentiment. And they didn't care about the massive human rights violations, because in polarized situation, people just take care about their side. And this type of situation became, at the beginning was just rhetoric, right? And became even worse with time, at the point that right now, we don't have free and fair elections anymore. Everything started by attacking the political leaders, and the supporter started to applaud it. Then they started to attack the media, and the supporter of him started to applaud it. Then they started to go against the private industry, and the supporters started to applaud it. At the end, they destroyed the complete country, and no one applauded anymore. Now we have the worst refugee crisis in the history of the continent, the worst humanitarian crisis in the history of the continent. And he knew that in order to do that type of transformation, and also Maduro, he needed to polarize society. So we know the consequence of that. I went through to see families divided completely thanks to polarization. I had to escape 5 years ago from Venezuela because of the persecution of the regime. So I know the consequence of polarization. Polarization is not a disease that we have to, that we could underestimate. It's actually the open gate for later in Venezuela. This was persecution, and with persecution, control. And in Venezuela, it was even worse because Chavez was a military. And in military terms, the enemy needs to be eliminated. So when he was creating this logic that those that were not with me are against me, and trying to make them as the enemy of the government, they create this disastrous situation that was, I think it was well explained 1 month ago by the United Nations latest report on Venezuela, where they describe that what is happening in Venezuela are, there are based ground to believe there are crimes against humanity being committed in Venezuela, because we're talking about more than 14,000 people being killed for extrajudicial killing. We have more than 15,000 people being detained. We have, so basically it's a policy to eliminate the complete opposition. And this took a long 20 years, but in the 60s, we were the stronger democracy in the region. And I know 20 years, it's a long period, but if you see the level of disaster that is right now in Venezuela, you will never believe it. When I started defending human rights, I would never thought in my worst nightmare that something like this will be the end, or we will arrive to this point in my life, living in exile and seeing more than 6 million Venezuelans forced to escape from the country because of the consequence of a group who control completely the state. And I think that the base of all that was their strategy to polarize society. And I think they won through with that strategy. And now there's no any more polarization in Venezuela. Only like 15% of the population support Maduro, because they don't need any more the debate. Now they just control completely our society.
And that's a very important point, I think, of how you move from polarization to authoritarianism and capture the very people that were on your side. Manu, you have the job of wrapping us up with a very complex society. with only 5 minutes. So I ask that, we could go back to Indira Gandhi and all sorts of things, but why don't you focus on the BJP, the latest issues of political violence, and this issue of polarization, and see if you can hit those in 5. You're muted, Manu.
Sorry, thank you so much, Rachel, and thank you so much to Nada and Isabella and Opengov Hub and Global Integrity for inviting me to my fellow panelists. So my job in 5 minutes is to give a quick case study of India so we can get to a larger conversation about polarized democracies and what that might tell us to the US. So I'm going to ask, Rachel just asked me to do, focus primarily on Modi in the last few years. So a new central government headlined by the BJP, the Bharatiya Janata Party, emerged in 2014 to much fanfare in India, led by the charismatic Narendra Modi. Modi had a reputation for good governance and development earned from his time as chief minister of an important Western Indian state. But a series of concerning incidents targeting minorities and dissenting intellectuals has raised some very serious alarms. And this trend has become only starker since Modi's landslide re-election in 2019. A quick, just to set the scene, India is the world's largest democracy and a multi-ethnic pluralistic one. It is the 3rd largest economy by GDP in the world and is also a nuclear and space power. So it shares a number of things in common with the United States. That said, there are many differences as well. One important example is that it is a parliamentary democracy as opposed to a presidential one. The current government of India is led by the 69-year-old larger-than-life figure, Modi. Modi rose to power with a hard scrabble rags to riches story. He was a tea seller and so embodies for many the Indian dream, that he took out the dynasty of the Nehru Gandhis, long the leaders of the country and rumored to be rich and corrupt, has been icing on the cake for many people. Modi was elected in 2014 and re-elected in 2019, with his party winning a clear majority on its own, but it's in a coalition, so has even greater power. Modi had achieved fame and infamy during his time as chief minister of that state, which was from 2001 to 14, when he supposedly spurred innovation and investment and led to a development boom in the state. But he was dogged by rumors and legal cases that held him directly or indirectly responsible for massacres that occurred in the state in 2002 and directed at the state's minority Muslim population. His defenders claim that he was not responsible for these events and that he has been exonerated of such charges. A bit on him, he's a member of the RSS and his party, the BJP, is a political arm of the RSS. The RSS and the party subscribe to right-wing religious nationalist agenda, to a right-wing religious nationalist agenda. In 2016, I saw a number of parallels between Modi and Donald Trump, and this spurred me to write about the rise of global authoritarianism in work that then went viral. There were notable differences between Modi and Trump, of course, one being that Modi simply was a much more capable politician. Modi spent his first term rolling out a number of initiatives to much fanfare and soaking in a developing international celebrity. Basically, he used slogans to be very inclusive and was just enormously popular throughout the country and the world. But there were striking similarities to Trump as well, Modi's love of show and the spotlight and media attention. And he rolled out some big things because he loved to get the attention for it. Demonetization and a national goods and services tax are two examples. Both of those exploded in his face. They were terrible and disasters for the Indian economy. Meanwhile, across India, hate crimes and other attacks on marginal communities and intellectuals began to rise, picking up steam after 2016, paralleling things in the US and around the world. This is key to where we are now. Modi remained popular through all of this. He faced withering criticism from some quarters, but those criticisms were largely ineffectual. And he came back to power in May 2019 in a thumping majority. We can talk about the parallels and the contrasts during the discussion. In the weeks and months that followed Modi's second innings, as the term euphemistically is called in sports terms, the government has authorized a whole series of bold moves. Basically, policies that singled out regions and targeted minorities especially were unveiled. And basically, there were now open declarations of majoritarian sentiments and capturing the media. That's my 5 minutes. I'm on my last point. So where are we right now in India? Intellectuals and dissenters have been arrested. There is a climate of fear and anger and resentment in the country. The COVID response and overall economic policies have really hit the economy, revealing a weakness in governance as opposed to politics. This is possibly where Trump could take the United States as well, except maybe magnified by about 100 times, because Trump does not have Modi's political capabilities. So I'm happy to discuss all of this further in the discussion. And I apologize for that kind of quick read through, but it was a lot, and I just wanted to make sure I got everything in 5 minutes. Thanks.
If only all speakers had 5-minute beepers, I would be an easier moderator. I think Isabella wants to share a poll.
Yep, sharing now. And the highest concern for the elections in November in the US is voter suppression and intimidation at 52%. And I think everyone can see the rest of the polls, but the second runner-up is that Trump may refuse to concede power. So I'll leave these up if anyone has any comments on it, and then we can move to the discussion.
Terrific. I think I've got 3 big questions I want to pose to our speakers, and I'm going to pose the same question across the speakers to see if we can get some compare and contrast. And then I really do want to turn to Q&A, so please do populate that space. So Venezuela, there have been pieces written about your opposition movement. A number of people saw the problems with Chavez early on and tried to organize against him when he was a popularly elected leader with quite a large following, and that didn't work very well. And so I'd love to hear who the opposition was, what strategies they used, whether they worked or not, what you think could have been done differently. And then I'll be posing the same question, Christoph, to you and Manu to you.
Thank you, Rachel. I think it's really difficult to understand what we did wrong, because we're still in the process of maybe doing things wrong. It's pretty sad, but it is true. I have this example always also to explain. Maybe try to fight against people that have the plans to control a society. It's very difficult to really win that battle. And the best example is like a thief when he's going to enter to your house or is going to steal you something in the street. He already analyzed all your responses. So every type of response that you will do, he already have a plan against that. So when the guy arrived and tried to steal your wallet, anything that he already have how to defend himself, and you are just reacting. So basically the story of the opposition has been always reacting to these crazy tactics. Who thought that Chavez was going to close the oldest TV channel in the history of Venezuela? Who thought that he was going to control, fire 20,000 people from the oil industry in one day and hire completely new people and tell them that if they could protest again against him, he will fire them all again. So like tactics that we never saw it before. And when we try to ask for support internationally, no one say anything. They create a list of more than 3 million people that vote against him. And he published that list. That it was called the Tascon list. And all the people that were in the list were fired from the government. And nobody's, so basically, I think the evil of these people is to always surprise you in a way that is so difficult. That's why you have institutions to defend you. But when you have weak institutions like what we have, it was not good enough. So of course, I'm not saying that we didn't make any mistakes. I'm sure I start with the conversation saying we've made a lot of mistakes, but I think we were in disadvantages in front of a bigger plan. That was a plan to completely control society, control the government, the state. And that plan was from the beginning and it surprised everybody. So I don't know, that's my opinion on that. Of course, we should have maybe we underestimate them. That was the most important error. We underestimate the regime, and we never thought that they were going to be able to really actually make that plan real, but they did.
Thank you, Rodrigo. And I should posit, I'm not trying to criticize anyone in this position. I'm just trying to learn some lessons here. These are hard, and they're hard because, as you said, no one expects your entire democratic regime to be so challenged and to fall apart like a house of cards. We're seeing the same thing, I would say, in America, the weakness of institutions we thought were quite strong. Christoph, thoughts on what the opposition did, lessons learned?
I mean, same here. The problem with the opposition, which is a bit another story, is that they were a ruling party for already 10 years. It's hard to get the same energy as the people who have this good narrative. And they were using a great and fresh narrative, like starting from the social programs, which was like giving money to the people, which is fine with me. But it was then later only that we saw this is a price that we are paying for the budget, actually, also to get the people supporting the government, because the part of the narrative is if you elect the now opposition and if you will fight with the government, you will lose what you gain. And that's also problematic for the opposition, because opposition had no this idea before when they were a ruling party. The narrative of the Law and Justice Party, so the ruling party right now, is like super pro-democratic. And as well, I see a lot of similarities with US, saying like these are, the people who are in power, they are like elites with privileges, and we're coming to grab the power to give the real democracy back to people. And it was a very nice image. And I think it's a broader discussion. Like me as a human rights activist with really broad sense of freedom of expression, feel sometimes I want to restrict the freedom of expression by using the term hate speech, for example, and how we will deal with the hate speech and disinformation. So at the point of a narrative, there are more like human rights defenders sometimes than we are, which is crazy. But I'm just underlining on the narrative point, not in facts. And also, I think like decent people. Let's face it. Like we couldn't imagine that, because it's normal. We're used that any government, whether it's a left, liberal, right-wing government, they are appointing new people. They are grabbing the positions within different institutions, but not to such extent. Including the public media. Like the public media is in the hands of the government, so you have a really freedom to build the narratives later. And the overwhelming, there's like every institution at some point, also today, just before we have started the event, here there was a voting on new ombudsman, so the citizen, the institution that protects citizens' rights. We had a great privilege to have a really independent one, because he was already elected in 2015. Now the ruling party hasn't agreed for the also objective independent candidate. And it was the last resort for citizens, unfortunately. So the system in Poland is closed.
On that happy note, although I think the Hungarians could have said that, a few years before you, and so we see that trajectory.
Can I just make one remark on that? And this
Sure.
is true that like when our now ruling party enter into the power, I was talking with my colleagues from Hungary, and they were saying, "Oh, this is going to happen. This is going to happen. This is going to happen," and they were absolutely right. But I couldn't believe it can happen so quickly, because it's happening much quicker than it happened in Hungary, actually. But it's the same scenario.
Manu, we've had much longer for opposition to mobilize against Modi from his time in leadership in Gujarat and the events that happened there, the violent pogroms and so on. And yet he still made it to national office, and yet he won a second election. What do you think we can learn from how the opposition tried to derail him, and what's happened since?
I think the opposition in India has made a couple of mistakes, one of which is just that it clings to this dynasty, and that's this Nehru-Gandhi dynasty, which has ruled India in the Congress Party, and the Congress Party basically since independence. Many people just got tired of that. It doesn't really matter who the person is or what they can offer. It just looks like more of the same. So I think that's one problem. And the second problem was that they were in power preceding Modi's arrival to the national stage. And they managed to get swamped with allegations of corruption. Now, that was also something that was persistent over decades in India, and so it stuck that the other government was corrupt. And Modi had this reputation for being a hard worker, for clean government, these kinds of things. And the risks of what he had done as chief minister were dismissed because he was, he got clean chits and so on through some of the formal systems. So I think the mistake was first in the opposition itself. It stultified and it refused to grow and adapt. And then I think there was a reliance amongst certainly a liberal intellectual class on institutions, much what Christoph described as well, that people simply believed that it doesn't really matter and that the institutions would be strong enough and it would ward off the worst possible tendencies and he would grow into the position. I think everyone believed these same things around the world. And the truth is that it did at some level keep him in check in his first term. It did. What he said he wanted to do on the international stage, the language he used was kind of typical broad-minded language. What was happening on the ground, which was denied, was the other issue. But subsequently, I think now it's become clear and basically at this point, institutions have been captured. Again, what Christoph described, a very similar kind of thing. So the last mistake I think people made is simply that it takes a willingness to work together and a consensus, at least in democracy, for everything to work. If one side is committed to derailing all of that and to saying power at all costs, well, unless you treat that group as outside of the system and therefore not warranting the protections of the system, they have the ability to bring the whole system down. They just do. If they work within the system and they can find a base that they appeal to and they can come to power legitimately, and then once in power, their aim is to destroy the whole thing, they have that ability. And it's very hard to get them out. It doesn't mean it's impossible, but it's very hard.
So I want to get to that come to power legitimately part because we had a lot of questions about the election and suppression of votes. So that'll be my third question. But before we get to that, I want to pick up on this point that Christoph made, which was that in Poland, they started off with a lot of giveaways to people with kids, giveaways to all sorts of classes that cut across partisan groupings. And a lot of people didn't want to give those up. You have the rags to riches story of Modi, a tea seller who moved on up, and he appeals to other folks from that background. But the BJP party also has a very significant wealthy membership of higher upper class elites in India. So I want to talk about this ability of these leaders to appeal to believers, but also give red meat to actual groups they need to support themselves in power, whether it's the military in Venezuela, the people of various parts of Poland and so on. So I think I'll start, Rodrigo, with you and just say, can you speak to this separation between the rhetoric and the red meat? Is the red meat real? Do you think it's important? Or do you think it's not something we should really be thinking about?
Sorry, I couldn't hear you. The difference between rhetoric and?
Sorry, I'm using an American expression. Yeah. Rhetoric and real giveaways to important constituencies that matter for electoral support. So in the United States, I would posit that the tax breaks that Trump made early on to corporations and so on have been extremely helpful in getting parts of the traditional Republican constituency who might not agree with a lot of the rhetoric to say, well, this is our guy, or anti-abortion things and so on. These are policy issues that they're giving away separate from the rhetoric for true believers, where people are getting parts of what they want from the regime. Does that make sense? Or shall I go to Christoph? And okay.
It makes sense. So basically in Venezuela, what happened is, I think Chavez won a lot of support because everything that he promised, and most of the bad things that he promised, he really mean it, and they were true. So basically, if he was going to close the TV channel, he said, and then he closed it years after. Or if he was going to destroy the position, he found a way how to do it. So basically, the rhetoric became real in Venezuela. Even the more socialist and the social agenda to help the poorest, the level of spending in Venezuela the last year of Chavez, if like the barrel of oil were in 190 and was around 100. But basically he spent it so much at almost like the double. And because he promised to build the more quantity of houses for income families, and etc. So basically, I think he was really good trying to match and look coherent to the audience, and that was something that maybe the opposition didn't have. And I don't know if something like that happened. And I remember when Trump arrived to power, people were like, had this similar sensation that he was genuine, that he was, even the bad things of him. So, I see a lot of similarities in the two characters. And I think I see similarities in all populist and super charismatic presidents and leaders. And basically, I think they use all of them the same tools because they have the capacity to really get into the minds and hearts of people, and they use it for their benefit. So in Venezuela, what happened is basically years after, we had to accept that everything that he was going to promote in an electoral campaign, it was going to happen. It was not rhetoric. So our mistake was for many years that we thought it was only rhetoric, and it was not.
Christoph, can you speak a little bit to these social giveaways and who benefited and whether that's been important to the staying power?
Yeah, sure. I think it was super important because also when we're talking about polarization, and also this is actually my fault a bit. I'm talking about like mobilization of these believers. So we have an image that we have two powers or two forces. There are two groups of citizens. While in fact, the maybe majority or the significant number of citizens are completely indifferent towards what's happening on the level of the states, in the public administration, etc. What they really want, and it's understandable, is to have a decent life. So when you have an extra funds for your kids, and this is about, let's say, $150 US dollars, which is not a great money, but like imagine what you can do with that every month when you have a kid. I mean, it's a great support. So you're not interested in, thinking about democratic institutions such as the Constitutional Tribunal, which is a bit obstructive to you, right? This is not something that you have in your normal life. So I think the giveaways were mostly given to those people who are indifferent, just to not make them being mobilized by the opposition, for example. Other thing also why the giveaways works is that a lot of people were saying, even those indifferent ones, and it is connected with the general lack of trust towards institutions that haven't happened, just started a few years ago, but it's a long process, is that every politician steals, but these guys are sharing with us. So that's also, it's a kind of an end, but this is what the people, like a layman citizen, I don't want to offend anyone with this, saying that this is a simple thinking, but that's also the truth, and something that we also, as the left liberals, I don't know, human rights protection, is also that the people are looking for this decent right. But sometimes when we're talking about human rights, about rule of law, these are the very abstract terms for a layman citizen. And that's, I think that's a problem also we're facing.
Thank you, thank you. Manu.
Well, I'd say two things quickly. One is that I think the key to understanding Modi's success in terms of rhetoric and deliverables, first is to look at the period of globalization beginning in the 90s and moving forward, where what happened is India kind of woke up and the middle class looked around and they looked at the tiger economies in East Asia and they said, what happened? Why do they look like that now? And why do we look like this right in contrast? They saw basically highly modern, sophisticated Western societies. I use those terms all in quotes. But that's what they saw, basically very wealthy, technologically advanced countries. And they didn't see that in themselves. So for a period in the 90s, this was explosive growth, a growth in consumerism, a growth in sort of adapting to all of these things. Nonetheless, and despite a period of growth through the early 2000s as well, there was the sense that India just had not taken the right policies. They blamed the opposition, they blamed the Congress party for making these choices and getting them into this position. So Modi's advantage was always that he claimed he could do this and transform the country faster, better, and bring it up to sort of this modern threshold, Western modern threshold, compared especially with East Asian economies, and notably in the more modern context, China. So that's his advantage. The other advantage that he has had and that he has really deployed is that there was sort of this continued resentment against minorities and what majority communities believed was minority appeasement. And Modi really played that card hard. And so he played to people's resentments, bigotries, hatreds, and he has really riled that up. Now, the difference in India with a lot of the other places is that there's a huge majority in the majority community. So 85% of the population, in theory, might go along. So he has a huge base to appeal to, and it has worked. He mobilizes humongous numbers on his behalf, and he remains to this day enormously popular because people see him as defending their interests, whether those interests are based on their ethnic identity or whether those are perceived to be the country's economic interests. And then the last thing in terms of who's actually keeping him in power, I mean, this is pretty obvious actually. Although India has a huge, is the third largest economy in terms of GDP, an incredible 70% of wealth generated in the last few years has only gone to the top 1%. And so imagine how much income inequality there is, or overall inequality, and how much it's being concentrated in just the hands of a few. And so obviously the elite class is thrilled with him and continues to bolster him, a kind of corporatism. And we can get into more complicated terms or more controversial ones, but certainly bringing us into that territory.
And I would just add to that you see the same thing in Nicaragua, you see the same thing in whether it's a left-wing regime or a right-wing regime. I think populism transcends those 20th century labels in getting support from the business community, from these key constituencies. The Chavez regime had the support of the military, even though it was a left-wing regime, and militaries are usually seen as right-wing. So I think it's important to be a little aware of those labels. Now, that was my buzzer saying 10 minutes, and we're supposed to get to questions. We have a lot of good ones, and there's no way to answer them all in the 9.5 minutes we have left. I'm going to take the first one because I can dispose of it fast, and then I'm going to try to group some of the others. But Veronica asked about, should we be worried about a second Trump term? What should we be most worried about? My own research and Yasha Monk's both say that second terms are extremely likely. Populists tend to win second terms, has been Yasha's finding. Mine is a little bit different, which is that authoritarian populists do sometimes lose. What comes in afterward is a Joe Biden type, exactly. It's a centrist politician from the other side who tries to right the wrongs within the existing institutions. That leader tends to inherit economic problems left over from the previous regime. They also tend to be boring to the press and get less coverage after all the fireworks and so on of the first regime. And finally, they don't please their base. The base wants blood after seeing what the other side has done to them. A centrist doesn't give blood. They try to rebuild institutions, and so they tend to be one-term leaders. And then you get more polarization afterwards. So I think we should be worried. And what do you see? It tends to be just a falling off a cliff. Things get much worse very quickly, as Manu was saying, after people are reelected. In terms of some of the other questions, do you see social sector control feeding into the rise of authoritarianism? How important has it been that journalists are being arrested, Manu, in India, that progressive organizations are having so much trouble in Venezuela, in Poland, and that that so many of you in Venezuela have had to go into exile, Rodrigo? Let's start with Manu this time.
I mean, absolutely. I mean, you know, the media is in the pocket of the government at this point. It's been completely captured to the extent that there's any counter left in that space. They're troll armies, which, you know, just nonstop try to berate, belittle, and dismiss, and it's the fake news mantra, which you know, really is people believe. So and now everyone who had dared to say anything during the first term is, not everyone, but large numbers of them, particularly symbolic ones, are being targeted, harassed, put in prison. You know, it's a kind of rolling attack on dissent meant to stifle whatever remaining dissent that there is. So I see it as part and parcel, and it's sustaining. However, I will say that India, at least in India, the international still matters, and India's relationship with the United States still matters. And so we'll see what happens. But to the extent that a rollback of Trump, I don't just see Trump as any other authoritarian populist. You know, I mean, I know he's part of a much longer sort of degradation of the Republican Party and so on in the US, but I see him as a totem around the world. You see right-wing forces in Germany carrying around Trump banners, for example, now. So he's a totem. And I think if he goes down, it's possible, goes down electorally. It's possible that might reignite opposition forces, not just in the United States, but around the world in a very different way than if this was just another case example. That's my view.
Sorry, we're in a lightning round. We have very little time. So I'll turn to Christoph and then Rodrigo.
Yes, okay. So I think when Trump's going to win, our government's going to be very happy, because our government is cooperating with not only the Trump administration as such, but also the people as Jack Posobiec, Matthew Thurmond, all of these guys who have the Polish roots, but they are like very much Trump supportive, and also gives a fuel for further disinformation. But from the perspective, now it's the second term of my government now, and like what I see is the more division and more polarization, because now it's, especially when you have the presidential context, when you can't run for the third term, you have nothing to lose. You're just building on what you want. I mean, literally, I know, like, only from the observations, of course, that Trump wasn't really open for any kind of criticism or feedback, let's put it this way. But I think for the second term, he will be completely deaf. That's for sure. When it comes to the narrative, the public media, the media as such, the public media are in the hands of the government, and they're using it very wisely. I mean, the level of the propaganda is anesthetic. It's not pretty. This is what I want to say, but it works, right? And on the other hand, we have some private medias, of course, and we are super happy about it. But on the other hand, the government can, and they doing it in practice, restrict freedom of information. So you are cutting off journalists from the information, and that also works. You don't have to own the media. And also the narrative would say like, oh, these are the media connected with the opposition because they're criticizing us. So again, building these big divisions within the society. And this is what worries me the most, I would say, because maybe there's a way to rebuild the institution. Maybe there's a way to fight the corruption, etc. But the division between the family members, between the society, that like we can't talk, we can't listen anymore to each other. And that's a huge problem. And that's we're going to face for the next decades, maybe even.
Thank you. And Rodrigo?
Yeah, just to finish, I think freedom of expression is the most important human right because it's the only one who defends the rest of human rights. They can steal, you know, any other type of right. You can be in a really terrible situation, but at least if you have a way to express, maybe you will regain that right. And that's what regime, the Maduro's and Chavez regime understood. And that's why they went after the media. And now that's why we have zero freedom of expression in Venezuela. Basically, everybody is controlled by the regime. And going back to polarization, I think presidents are symptoms of disease inside society. I think it's more important than thinking only about Trump or Biden. It's just the polarization inside the US. I think it should be tackled. And sometimes media also respond to that polarization with more polarization, and they don't see that they're also not helping to strengthen the debates and actually to not helping at all with a healthy debate. And today, Facebook also sometimes with the algorithm that they have, basically they encourage engaging, and sometimes there is more engaging if there is a polarized topic, and that's how they gain more money. And we need to take care of that. All of these aspects are also playing against us, and not give that only the importance to the presidents. I think one mistake that we did in Venezuela is that we give too much importance to the president, politicians, and we forgot about society. We forgot at the basis of society, and we enter into the game they created that was a polarized game. And that was when we lost the fight, when we actually followed that manipulative way to talk about the politics in a way that everybody who is not with you is your enemy, and we get captured in that logic, and that's how I think we start losing our country. So I think that it's my message to all the people today.
I wish we could get to all the questions. I'm so sorry to the questioners. When we started this planning process, I said there's no way in an hour we can cover what needs to happen. So really what we need is a 3-day conference in person without a pandemic. And we need that to have happened a year ago so that we could plan for this moment. But I appreciate all that Opengov Hub is doing now to helping us get ready. 3 points that I take away from this. First of all, you need to open your imagination, and not in a good way. I mean, we should really be planning for the worst. The lack of imagination is one of the big things that allows these situations to get so bad. We need to think of those followers of the other side more as believers than regular political citizens, and not try to fight with rational arguments, not try to convince with data and so on. There's an identity going on here that is not going to be altered with rational argument. And third, the societal set of issues here, actually 4, we can't rely on institutions as checks because institutions don't check belief. Institutions can check some elements of this, but they are made up of people, as I think Christoph said, and people can be non-democrats. And finally, this polarization itself is a disease in our society. And I think a lot of the questions got to this. How do you defend institutions if the institutions themselves aren't really worth defending because they were problematic in the first place? Absolutely true. In probably all of our societies, there are these problems of dislike